Let's add a few more points to close out this brief summary of the Adapt Now report. The other key systems are, of course, water, infrastructure, cities, and urban areas. Looking here at water, just a quick example. This is showing business as usual scenario. So the left map shows changes in GDP in 2050, assuming current water allocation remain unchanged. The right map shows change in GDP in 2050 assuming 25% of the water is reallocated to higher uses. Both maps take climate change into account using a combination of optimistic and pessimistic scenarios used by the IPCC. So SSPs here are shared socioeconomic pathways which make some choices in terms of how the societies will be governed, what are the renewable choices, and so on. So these are a step further from the representative concentration pathways, which focused much more on emissions and the resulting net radiative forcing. I have details of this in my course on Earth's climate. It's a section with many podcasts, many lectures on future climate change, where you can see these things. So you can see that there are significant drops in GDP by 2050, and unfortunately they're all in the global south, and they are in geopolitically sensitive regions, which is never a good idea. So if you then have efficient water policies which reallocate water for higher uses, as mentioned here, the water deficit regions of the Middle East and North Africa, which is referred to as MENA often, Middle East, North Africa, still remains dangerously at a loss in terms of GDP, especially if you imagine that these oil-rich countries are going to run out of oil, God forbid, by then, and they are warming very rapidly. So you can imagine how unstable this region is going to get. But there are many countries which would avoid a GDP loss and maybe even gain a little, all these regions here. And Africa, Sahara and Sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa remain neutral as well. So obviously there are uncertainties involved in these, and I don't want to get into the details, but when we run these models and look at the future, as I mentioned before in another context, the uncertainties in the beginning for out to 10 or 20 years may be related to model uncertainties, the physical models and the integrated assessment models and others involved. But once you go beyond a couple of decades, the uncertainty coming more from the assumptions in the scenarios themselves. But keep that in mind just for your edification. The urban planning with nature-based solutions offers in this report, based on other studies from elsewhere, increasing tree cover and green spaces to battle heat island effect. Urban heat island effect is really bad, and it is expected to get worse unless we take care of these adaptation strategies. So Toronto and Montreal are significantly expanding tree coverage and improving urban biodiversity and ecosystem connectivity. There are ideas of vertical farming and so on, rooftop gardens. So here community gardens help increase water retention while encouraging community building and local conservation. We talked about other strategies under drawdown as well. So Dresden is building an urban gardening network to help with district level regeneration effort. One thing about adaptation, it's always about a lot of case studies. Regional adaptation strategies may have transferable solutions that can be used elsewhere. So these case studies help. That's why these are mentioned here as well. Greening rooftops to reduce summer heat, provide winter insulation, and reduce stormwater runoff. Chicago's green rooftops have helped slow stormwater runoff by 36%. Increasing permeable surfaces and wetlands to increase natural infiltration of rainwater and reduce stormwater runoff. China's sponge cities pilot aims to capture, refuse, or absorb up to 80% of stormwater runoff in urban areas by 2030. So there are already many adaptation strategies being implemented, planned, and understood. This is about infrastructure, very quickly, a systems approach to strengthening asset and system resilience. So infrastructures are typically longer time investments, and they must take climate risk into effect while planning and implementing. That's one of the main messages. Higher standards for critical infrastructure links. So pavement designed to resist melting in high temperatures, roadway elevated to reduce flood risks, drainage designed for heavier rainfall, added redundancy for key infrastructure, avoid construction in high-risk areas, retreat from the coastlines where sea level rise is projected to be rapidly rising and very fast. So talking about case studies, protecting people from extreme heat. Germany and India have both responded to devastating heat waves with action plans that focus on protecting their most vulnerable citizens. After a 2010 heat wave killed more than 1,300 people in Ahmedabad, India, 1,300 people, Ahmedabad, India took quick actions, training healthcare staff, distributing water, painting roofs with white reflective paint. Just this week, a report came out that the whitest paint has been invented now to reduce the heat in homes by as much as 5 degrees centigrade. Most homes in India don't have air conditioning, so this is really going to affect people differently in different socioeconomic strata. Thanks to this heat action plan, fewer than 20 people died in a similar heat wave in May 2015 in Ahmedabad. Fantastic news. 30 other Indian cities have adopted the plan, and the Indian National Disaster Management Authority has issued guidelines based on it. Okay, and so on. So the Hess region even created a quality climate adapted seal to ensure standards of climate fit nursing care. Couple of slides I missed, I'll go back and show as examples. Here is the example of Bangladesh. Key policy interventions in Bangladesh contributed to reduced deaths from climate disasters. So 1970 cyclone Bola and 72, there was 300,000 deaths. Literally so many islands are sitting there. Even when there is a good forecast of a cyclone, there was no plan to evacuate them or move them. This was what would happen. The formation of a Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief in 1972 reduced the number of deaths here in 1990 to 138,000, still a massive number. But look at 2007 cyclone Sidra, down to 3,363. Still large, but compared to these numbers here, Cyclone Fani in 2019 down to 5 deaths. Similarly, India claims to have reduced the number of deaths in various disasters like storms, landslides, floods, extreme temperatures, epidemics, and earthquakes. It had an upswing in all of them from 1960s into the 1990s, and since then it has accomplished steep drops in the number of deaths in these natural disasters, which are being exacerbated by human activities, of course. There are nice details on vulnerability studies which show that simple things like educating women helps reduce vulnerabilities, because women with a little education even can better understand the early warnings and take action to save the property, lives of children and themselves, and so on. So for adaptation finance, key sources and users of adaptation here. Sources are down here, users are up here. So governments, businesses and households, everybody aiming for reduced climate risk. There are tax revenues, retained earnings and savings, international development assistance and climate finance. This is still going on. Lots of green fund and so on, other ideas have had mixed success. Transfers from government, bank credit. World Bank is funding lots of adaptation projects. Payouts from insurance and other risk pooling instruments, sovereign, meso and micro. Reinsurance industries, which insure insurance industries, also are taking great care on assessing climate risks and setting their reinsurance rates, and insurance companies are paying attention to premiums in flood risk zones, sea level rise zones, and so on and so forth. Capital markets, bonds and equity, venture capital and private equity. So there are now what are called impacted investments, I think, where people are investing based on paying attention to climate risks and making sure that adaptations are reducing climate risks and so on as well. Okay, so that's a rather short introduction to this very nice report. As I said, the action plan is looking for revolutions in understanding, in finance, in policy, and so on. Hopefully it'll happen soon, but COVID obviously keeps hammering everything. But this plan is meant to go out to 2030, but the beginning is very important. So the year of action is very critical, and watch out for that to happen soon.